The last of Colton Vane's cattle went off the block at the Caprock stockyards on a white-hot September afternoon in 1883. And when the auctioneer's hammer fell, the third time, he owned nothing in the world but the sweat-dark hat crushed in his two hands and a debt with his name on it that he could not pay. 30 years old, and he stood in the dust below the sorting rail with his back straight, the way a proud man stands when pride is the last thing left to him, while above him 3 men sat the top rail like buzzards settled on a dead limb, and between them the 3 held every dollar of his paper. Dunstan Pryor in the middle, smooth and slow and unhurried, the biggest outfit on the whole plateau. His iron the /P Harmon Sloat at his right, sour as green fruit. The H.S., a man who smiled like every smile cost him money. Verl Ott at his left, loud and crude as a busted gate swinging in wind, the O-bar. It was Pryor who spoke, because it was always Pryor who spoke first. "I'll make you a wager, Vane," he said. "Easy, loud enough for the whole yard to turn and hear him. Ada Mercer, the big dressmaker, the one this county's been laughing at for years, wants a husband and can't buy one. You marry her. You stay married 1 full year, start to finish, and I'll tear up every note you owe the 3 of us and deed you Tule Draw, free and clear, 4 sections under the rim." Everyone in that yard knew Tule Draw, and knew why the offer of it was a cruelty dressed as a gift. 4 dead sections of alkali scrub folded into the badland below the Caprock rim. Ground gone so white and bitter with salt that no cow had watered there in 20 years, the joke land the 3 barons had taken back off a dozen busted homesteaders, one at a time, and could not give away, nor sell, nor burn. That was the prize. "And should you break before the year is out," Pryor added. And here the ease slid off his voice, and something colder sat down in its place. "Should she leave you, or you leave her? Then we call every note at once, all of it, and you ride down off this plateau for good, and you do not come back up the grade." Then the other 2 started in, the way men do at another man's expense. 6 months, said Pryor himself, laying it down first like the top card off a clean deck. "I give the poor devil 6 months before he runs." Harmon Sloat spat over the rail and wiped his mouth. 3, he said flatly. 3 months. No man born could sit across a table from that 190 nights running, and Verlot laughed so hard he had to catch the rail to keep from going off it backward. And when he had his wind, he hollered it out for the whole yard to hear. 2 weeks, he crowed. 2 weeks, boys, and I'll lay my best cutting horse on it. 2 weeks, and he comes crawling back down that grade, begging us to take the salt ground back off him. And the whole yard laughed long and easy in the heat, and not one man in it, least of all the 3 lords on the rail, understood that he had just witnessed 3 notes get signed as binding as any drawn at a bank, that 6 months and 3 months and 2 weeks were 3 IOUs spoken out loud in front of 40 witnesses, and that there was a woman down in the town who had kept a faithful account of every debt opened within her hearing since she was a girl of 12, and who would, in her own time and to the very day, collect all 3. Colton Vane heard none of that future. He heard only the laughing. He kept his eyes on his own broken boots, because a man looks at his boots when he is being handed the one thing he has no choice on earth but to accept, and he turned the hat over once in his hands. A played-out horse, a stripped saddle, a debt he could not carry, and a pride gone suddenly the most expensive thing he owned, and so low that the auctioneer had already opened the next lot over the top of it, he said the word that married him. Done. If this story moves you, subscribe and stay with me to the very last word, and drop the name of your town in the comments below, because I want to see just how far Ada's story travels tonight, because what happened on that plateau over the next 4 years changed what every man in Texas thought he knew about power. To understand what the 3 barons had truly staked and what Colton Vane had truly agreed to, you have to come down off the Stockyard Hill and into the town of Caprock itself to a narrow frame shop on the shaded side of the square with the single word Mercer lettered in gold, gone soft and flaked on the window glass. Inside it, at the hour the hammer was falling on Colton's cattle, a woman knelt on a scrubbed pine floor with a mouthful of pins and both hands full of another woman's wedding dress. Her name was Ada Mercer. She was 33 years old, broad through the shoulder and heavy built, a woman this town had spent her whole life weighing with its eyes before it ever once troubled to hear her speak, and it had decided about her long ago. The way small towns decide, that a woman built as she was built was good for sewing other women's fine days and for nothing else at all. Ada had long since stopped arguing with that. She let them think it. She had found, over 33 years, that a woman the world has settled on as furniture can sit in any room she likes and hear everything said over her head, and she had been listening her whole life. Her hands moved over the dress without hurry. She read cloth the way another might read print, a glance down a seam telling her where it pulled and where it hung, and she set her pens by eye and chalked her line clean and true without ever once reaching for the tape. Because she did not need the tape, she could look at a shoulder or a waist and know its measure to the half-inch. The same certain way she could look at a steer across a pen and name its weight within 10 pounds before it ever crossed a scale. That was the thing the town did not know about Ada Mercer, or had forgotten, or had never thought to ask. Her measuring eye had not been trained on cloth, it had been trained on cattle. Her father had been Ezra Mercer, a cattle trader, and in his day there had not been a better set of eyes on the whole Caprock Plateau. Ezra could stand at an open gate with his hat pushed back and a herd pouring through it in a river of horn and dust, and he could count them through, count them moving, which any drover will tell you is a different and harder thing than counting them standing still, and never miss the tally by more than 3 head in 300. He could lay his hand on a beef's ribs and tell you what it had eaten and what it was worth and what it would weigh come fall. And because the Lord had given Ezra Mercer a daughter and no son, and because Ezra was too practical a man to waste a good eye for the accident of the body it was born in, he had taken Ada out to the pens and the gates and the sale yards with him from the time she was small and taught her everything he knew, and the center of everything he knew was the book. Ezra kept tally books, long narrow ledgers bound in cracked leather, and into them went the whole truth of the cattle business as he understood it. Weights and prices, which grass fattened and which only filled, where the water stood in a dry year and where it failed, what a steer cost in the spring and fetched in the fall, and what the difference came to after the cost of the grass between. Numbers were the only thing Ezra Mercer fully trusted, because a number cannot be charmed and cannot be bullied and does not care whose feelings it hurts, and he had raised his daughter to trust them the same. Ada had kept his books for him since she was 12 years old, kept them in her own careful hand when his eyes began to fail, sat at the kitchen table by lamplight, and set down the day's figures while he told them to her from his chair, and she had never stopped keeping them, not through his long dying, and not after. She had them still, the whole stack, wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom of her cedar chest beneath the bolts of good wool she could not afford to sell. And on the last written page of the very first book, in Ezra's own hand, faded now to the color of weak tea, was a thing he had drawn one winter night and spoken of the way a man speaks of a country he means some day to see. A brand, a simple brand, an M standing over a straight bar, the Mercer brand he had called it. The iron he would register the day he finally had cattle of his own to burn it into instead of only buying and selling other men's. He had never had that day. He had died a trader on other men's beef, and the brand had stayed on the page, drawn and never lived, an inheritance of pure intention passed down to a daughter the whole town believed had been left nothing at all. It was Nella Cobb who brought her the news of the bet, and Nella brought it the way she brought everything, at a run and out of breath and unable to decide whether to be furious or thrilled. Nella kept the counter at the mercantile 2 doors down, a small, sharp bird of a woman, and about the one soul in Caprock who had ever treated Ada as a person rather than a fixture, and she came through the shop door that evening with her shawl half off her shoulders before the little bell above it had finished ringing. The whole town already had it, she said. The whole town had had it within the hour, the way the stockyard emptied its stock into the saloon, and the saloon emptied it into every kitchen on the square. Dunstan Pryor and Harmon Sloat and Verl Ott had bet the vain boy he couldn't stay married. And here Nella caught herself and softened it, because she loved Ada, married to Ada for a year, and had staked him the salt ground under the rim on it, and the three of them had sat up on that rail and named off the months like they were calling a horse race, 6 and 3 and 2 weeks, and the whole yard had laughed itself sick. Nella said it, and then stood, twisting her shawl, watching Ada's face braced for tears, because that was what the news deserved and what any other woman would have given it. Ada Mercer did not give it tears. She had been taking the pens out of her mouth while Nella talked, one by one, setting them in the felt cushion strapped to her wrist, and when Nella finally ran out of words, Ada was quiet a moment. And then she asked one question, and it was not the question Nella expected. She did not ask how they could be so cruel. She asked, which land exactly did they say? And Nella, thrown, said she thought it was Tool Draw, the dead 4 sections down under the Caprock rim, the piece nobody would take. And something moved across Ada Mercer's face then that Nella Cobb would spend years afterward trying to describe and never quite manage, not hurt and not anger, but the still, focused, faraway look of a trader who has just heard a price. That night, Ada Mercer did the thing no one in Caprock would have predicted, and the thing the 3 barons had not priced into their wager at all. She did not wait to be asked. Colton Vane was camped where a stripped man camps, at the edge of the wagon yard below the stockyard. A small, mean fire, and a played-out horse on a picket, and a saddle for a pillow. And it was there Ada came to him on foot, in the last of the light, a big woman in a plain dark dress crossing the yard unhurried with a folded paper in her hand, and Colton got up at the sight of her the way a man does when he is not sure whether he ought to be ashamed. She did not make him wait, and she did not make it soft. She had spent the hours since Nella left her doing the only thing she trusted, which was arithmetic, and she had come with terms. She told him she would marry him. She said it plainly, before he could find whatever apology or excuse he'd been building, and while he was still swallowing it she laid out the rest the way her father had taught her to lay out a trade, every piece named, nothing left to be discovered later. Her property stayed hers. She would have a separate property agreement drawn and signed at the county clerk's office before ever they stood up in a church. Her shop, her bolts of cloth, her father's books, and every dollar she had, saved a hard dollar at a time, would remain hers alone and pass through no man's hands, married or not. She would keep the books. Whatever they built, whatever came of it, the accounts were hers to keep and hers to hold, and she would not be argued out of it. And whatever came of that deed to Tool Draw, if it came at all, if he lasted the year the barons swore he wouldn't, it would go on record at the county seat in both their names, hers beside his, in ink, where no man's word could later unwrite it. Colton Vane stood on the far side of the little fire and listened to a woman he had never once spoken to lay out his own marriage like a bill of sale, and he did not know what to say, and so he said the one honest thing in him. He asked her why. Why would she do it? Why would she tie herself to a broke man and a whole town's laughter for a piece of dead ground? And Ada Mercer looked at him across the fire, steady and unbothered, and gave him the truth folded down small enough to carry. "You need a year," she said. "I need land. The town needs a joke. All 3 can be had in one church." And that was all. She left the folded paper with him, the terms in her own hand, for him to read by firelight and sign or not, and she walked back across the wagon yard in the dark the same unhurried way she had come. And behind her Colton Vane sat down slow beside his little fire and read it through twice. And somewhere in the second reading the shame in him began, without his leave, to turn into something that was not quite hope, but stood in the same place hope would one day stand. They were married 4 days later, on a bright cold morning, in the small frame church on the corner of the square, and half the town found a reason to be near the square that morning to see it done. It was a sparse wedding, and a short one. Ada wore her good dark dress and carried nothing, and Colton wore a borrowed coat that did not quite meet across his shoulders, and the preacher read the words fast, the way a man reads words he does not entirely approve of, and the few filled pews held more smirks than well wishes. Folks had come the way folks come to a hanging or a horse advertised to buck, not to honor the thing but to watch it. And in the very back pew, in a row, sat the three of them, Dunstan Pryor with his hat on his knee and his smooth face composed into something just short of a smile, Harmon Sloat sour beside him, and Verlot barely able to hold his amusement inside the walls of a church. They had come to watch their wager begin. Ada Mercer stood up before that room with her back as straight as Colton's had been in the stockyard dust, and she made her vows in a clear, flat voice that carried clean to the back pew and did not shake, and she signed the register in her own careful hand, the same hand that kept the books, and it was done, and they were married, and the town had its joke, married to its joke exactly as promised. But it was at the church door, in the cold, bright light, that the barons could not help themselves, because men who have laid a wager cannot let it pass unspoken. As the new husband and wife came out into the morning, the three of them were waiting on the step, and each in his turn touched his hat brim to the bride with a courtesy that was itself the cruelty, and each named his term again, out loud, stamping his own IOU a second time in front of witnesses without the first idea that he was doing it. 6 months, Mrs. Vane, said Pryor, smooth as ever, tipping his hat. 3, said Sloat, and did not trouble to tip his, and Verlot laughed his loud laugh right there on the church step and swept his hat clean off his head. 2 weeks, ma'am, he said. 2 weeks. And no hard feelings. Ada Mercer looked at each of the three in turn, unhurried, the way she looked at a bolt of cloth to judge its worth, and she said not one word to any of them, and that saying nothing was the first quiet payment she ever took on debts the three of them did not yet know they owed. She had heard them. She always heard them, and she filed the three of them away, 6 months, 3 months, 2 weeks, in the same place she kept every other number that had ever mattered. They loaded the wagon that same afternoon, everything Ada Mercer owned in the world that she had not sold or stored, the cedar chest and the oilcloth bundle of her father's books, riding careful in the middle of the bed where nothing could shift down onto them, and they drove out of Caprock, with the town watching them go, and climbed the long road up toward the rim as the day went gold, and then began to fail. It was dusk when the wagon came at last to the lip of the Caprock, to the place where the plateau simply ended and the rim road tipped over the edge and began its switchback crawl down into the country below, and there Colton drew up the horses without being asked. Because a man stops at the top of a thing like that, whether he means to or not. Below them, in the last gray light, lay Tule Draw. It was every bad thing the barons had promised, and not one thing better, 4 sections of low gray scrub running out toward the badland, and down in the fold of it the dull glint of an alkali seep gone white at its edges like an old sore, and off to one side a single leaning shack the color of weathered bone, and over all of it a silence that had swallowed a dozen men's hopes and not so much as belched. Colton looked at it and said nothing, because there was nothing in him to say to it. But Ada Mercer, beside him on the wagon seat, did not look at the ruin of it the way he looked at it. She reached down into the oilcloth at her feet and drew out the topmost of her father's books, the newest and the least filled, and she opened it across her knees to the first clean page. And she took the stub of pencil from behind her ear, and there in the failing light, in her careful hand, she wrote the date at the top of the page and underlined it once, the way her father had taught her to open any account she meant to keep honest, and then she closed the book over her thumb and looked down the rim road into the dark that was gathering below. And Colton clucked to the horses, and the wagon started down off the rim into Tule Draw, the brake shoes moaning against the wheels, and neither of them said a single word. The wagon went down the rim road in the last of the light, with the near wheel grinding on caliche and the off wheel dropping into ruts a freighter's team had cut years back that no one had graded since. And neither of them said anything the whole slow way down, because there was nothing yet to say that the land was not already saying for them. Two-wheel draw came up out of the dusk the way a poor thing comes up, all at once and smaller than you hoped. The shack leaned against a low cut-bank where the draw made its bend, a single room of warped board and a stovepipe gone rust-orange, and a window so filmed with old grease and blown grit that it held the last of the light like a dirty coin. Below it, the alkali seep glinted white and dead in the flat, and above it the gray scrub ran up toward the rim. And that was the whole of the 4 sections the 3 men on the fence rail had staked against a year of Colton Vane's pride. Dead ground, they had called it, laughing. Dead ground below the caprock that would break the both of them by spring. Colton pulled the team up in the yard and sat a moment looking at the shack the way a man looks at the size of what has been done to him. And then he got down heavy and went to see to the horses without a word. Ada climbed down after him, broad and unhurried, and she did not go inside to grieve the poorness of the place the way another woman might have, standing in the door with her hand to her mouth. She lit the lamp. She set her father's tally book on the plank table where the light would fall on it, and she opened a fresh page. And she began to count. That was the thing the town of Caprock had never once thought to reckon with when they married the big dressmaker to the town joke to settle a bet, that Ada Mercer, 33 years old and weighed by every eye in that county her whole life, did not look at a bare room and see what was missing. She looked at it and counted what was there. She counted the boards in the walls and wrote the number down. She counted the cedar posts stacked and half rotted along the cut bank, 31 of them still sound enough to reset, and wrote that. She counted the panes in the milky window and the lengths of stovepipe and the nails she pulled from a coffee tin on the sill. And she went through the lean to with the lamp held high and counted a broke-handled axe, a hay fork with 2 tines, a keg of cut nails, a third full 40 feet of chain, a branding iron with no brand she knew burned into a scrap of pine beside it, and a good crosscut saw somebody had oiled before they gave up and left, which told her the last man out had not been a fool, only a beaten one. She counted the flour, 9 pounds in the sack and a little spilled, and the beans and the salt and the coffee and the twist of tobacco Colton would not admit he was glad to find, and she wrote each against its line. And when she had counted every board and post and pound and tool that Thule draw held, she totted the column the way her father, Ezra Mercer, had taught her to tot a column before she was 12 years old, and she looked at the sum, and it was not nothing. A beaten man leaves a place and sees only what is gone. Ada Mercer opened her book and saw what was left, and what was left was a start. In the first days she walked the 4 sections corner to corner with the old books under her arm, not the new tally book, but the older ones, the cracked leather ledgers her father had carried through this country when she was a small girl, and he was a cattle trader who could count a moving herd through a gate and never miss by 3, and she read the land against his pages. Ezra Mercer had traded through the Caprock in the 60s and the 70s, up from the Concho and back, and he had written down everything. Because a man who trades on the move learns fast that the country will lie to him and his own book will not, and so he had written the water. And on a page dated in the summer of 1866, in her father's small square hand, Ada found the line she had half remembered and driven up the rim road hoping was real, live water Thule draw, below the Caprock rim, never failed in the dry of 64. She stood in the dead flat, with the white seep glinting at her feet, and she read that line 3 times. The dry of 64 had been the drought the old men still measured every other drought against, the year the shallow water went to dust all across the plateau, and her father had stood on this same ground in that year and written that the water here had not failed. The creek the barons called dead was not dead. She could see it now that the book had told her where to look. The seep was not the spring. The seep was the spring drowned, a cienega silted full and trampled to soup by 20 years of loose cattle standing in it to drink until they had packed the mud over the vents and choked the flow to a weep. The water was still down there. It had only been buried by the carelessness of men who never thought to dig. She told Colton what she meant to do, and he looked at her like she had told him the moon was made of good grass. But he was a proud man, freshly stripped of everything a proud man counts, and he had nowhere else in the world to be, and so he took the shovel. They dug. They dug through the packed black mud and the tool roots that ran under the flat in a mat thick as a wagon sheet, cutting them out in slabs and dragging them clear, and under the roots came the gravel. And Ada got down on her knees in the wet, with her sleeves shoved back, and cleaned the old spring boxes with her 2 hands, the cedar cribbing some settler had sunk a lifetime ago that the silt had swallowed. And she felt along the bottom boards for the vents the way another woman would feel a hem for a dropped stitch, by touch, until she found where the cold came up. It came up faster as they cleared it. By the 3rd day there was standing water where there had been mud, and by the 5th it had begun to run, thin and clouded, down the old cut toward the flat, and by the end of that first week the water came clean, clear and cold and ceaseless, out of the gravel her father had written down 17 years before Ada was old enough to read his hand, running down the draw in a bright thread through grass that had not had a clean drink in 20 years, and Ada stood over it with mud to her elbows and did a thing she rarely let herself do, which was to feel the size of it. The 3 cattle barons had staked Colton Vane the deadest ground below the rim to be rid of him and to be sure of their bet. And the first thing that dead ground had given up to a woman with a shovel and her dead father's book was living water, the one thing on that whole plateau worth more than any of the 3 of them had troubled to price. She did not say so to Colton. She wrote it in the book. Water running, day 7. Then she drove to town to buy something to drink it. Caprock in those days was a rail-less huddle of board fronts on the wagon road, a bank and a mercantile and a saloon and a wheelwright and the church they had married in. And the day Ada drove in with her father's tally book on the seat beside her, the whole street knew her business before she had tied the team. Because that is how a town is. She went first to the Stockman's Bank, where Ambrose Teal kept his ledgers and his opinion of everyone in the county, and she listened, in the way she had learned from a lifetime of being talked past, to what the men at the counter were laughing about. What they were laughing about was cattle. Ambrose Teal had foreclosed a homesteader named Lem Hewitt off a dry claim east of the draw, and among the leavings the bank had taken was Hewitt's herd, 37 head of brush Longhorn, gaunt as rails and half wild, run down to hide and bone on ground that had quit on them, and Teal meant to be shut of them fast, because starving cattle eat money every day they stand. And he had already sent word to the hide and tallow man that the lot could go at $4 a head. $4, the price of a beast worth more dead for its hide and its rendered fat than alive on its feet. The joke lot, the men at the counter called it. Somebody said you would have to be simple to give Teal a nickel over hide money for Hewitt's walking skeletons. And somebody else laughed and said the only fool in the county who might was that big Mercer woman who had gone and married Vane's ruin. And the counter laughed, and Ada Mercer stood there broad and quiet with her book under her arm and let them laugh, and did the arithmetic. She did it the way her father had taught her, slow and cold and all the way to the bottom of the column. 37 head at $4 was $148 to Ambrose Teal, dead money, hide money, a loss he wanted off his books by Saturday. 37 Longhorn on clean water and drought feed, culled honest and bred right and given a year, was not hide money. It was a herd. It was the start her father's book had promised her stood on that dead ground if only somebody would count it right. And 37 starving brush cattle were exactly the kind of thing the whole plateau had already decided was too far gone to be worth a sound man's money, which was the same thing the whole plateau had decided about the woman standing at the counter. And Ada had spent 33 years learning that the 2 judgments were made by the same eyes and were wrong in the same way. She had a dress shop in town, the one thing in the world that was hers outright. the lease on the front room, the bolts of good wool and calico and muslin stacked near to the ceiling, the shears and the pins, and the long cutting table, and her mother's singer machine that she had treadled 10,000 yards of other women's wedding clothes through. She traded it. All of it. She signed the lease over, and she sold Teal the bolt stock and the fixtures against the herd, and she put $148 of her own hard savings down on top, and she bought the 37 head and Lem Hewitt's old spool wire and cedar posts that the bank counted as trash and threw in to be rid of, and she walked out of the Stockman's Bank a woman with no shop, no trade, no needle, and 37 of the sorriest cattle in Texas to her name. And Caprock laughed itself sick. It went up and down the street by dark, the best joke the town had had in a year. The joke had married the joke and bought the joke herd. The fat dressmaker had swapped her needle for a lot of dying steers a rendering man would not have fought her for. And they would all be picked clean and gone off the plateau by spring, and had not Verl Ott called it. 2 weeks had not he. Ada heard it the way she heard everything, and she folded it up small and did not carry it, and she went to bring her cattle home. The drive out to Tool Draw was the first time the town truly saw her work, though the town did not know that was what it was watching. 37 half-wild Longhorns strung out sullen on the wagon road behind a woman most men had never seen sit a horse, and she read them the whole slow way, every one, by eye and by hand. She rode down the string, and she looked at each beast the way her father had looked at cattle through a gate, at the sink behind the ribs, and the set of the hips, and the light or the dullness in the eye. And where an animal would let her she put her hand on it, felt the loose hide slide over the bone, lifted a lip to read the gum, watched how it threw its feet on the calichet, and she did not cull one head. Not one. Though every man who had seen the lot said the kindest thing to do with the half of them was to knock them in the head and save the grass. She culled none. She counted all 37 onto her water. But that night by the lamp she opened the tally book, and she wrote each animal down by its marks, and against 3 of them she wrote that they were past saving: an old muley cow with her teeth gone and no spring left in her, a steer with the black look of lung fever already down in his eye, and a little dry heifer whose gut hung the wrong shape. And against 9 of them she wrote that they were young and sound under the starvation, and would breed and hold, and against the rest she wrote what she judged each was worth brought back to flesh. She wrote it down because her father had taught her that a thing you only think will slide on you, and a thing you write you are held to, and the book does not forgive you and does not lie. And within the month the book was proved right, the way it would go on being proved right for 4 years until it became the thing that broke 3 rich men. The old muley went down first, and the lung fever steer behind her, and the dry heifer last, the 3 she had marked, and not one other, while the 9 she had marked to breed came up out of their bones on the clean water and the drought feed, and stood by fall as the seed of everything that followed. 37 standing. 3 marked to fall, the book written before the falling. That was the whole of Ada Mercer's gift, and the whole of what nobody in Caprock had thought to price. It was the water that brought Delfino Reyes up the draw. He came on a poor horse in the 2nd week, an old vaquero gone gray at the temples, with a rope-scarred hand and a way of sitting his saddle that said he had spent 50 years doing it, and he did not hail the shack. He rode to the water first. He got down and walked the spring Ada had dug out up and down the wet cut, and he crouched and put his fingers in the run and tasted it off his fingers the way a man tastes water he means to trust his life to. And then he walked the near bunch of cattle and lifted the lip of the muley cow and looked at her gum and set her head down gentle, and he came to the shack last, and he took off his hat. He had ridden for Ezra Mercer, he said, a long time gone, trailing cattle up from the Concho when the girl at the table had been a child on a wagon seat. And he had heard in town that Mercer's daughter was on the dead ground below the rim with her father's books. And he had not believed the part about the water until he stood in it. He was drawing day wages down at the O-Bar, he said, and not all of them, because Verlot had a way of counting a Mexican's days short and daring him to argue the sum. Ada set her father's books on the table and let him look, because a man reading your work is paying you the only respect his kind pays easy. And Delfino Reyes turned the cracked pages with one scarred finger and stopped at the notes her father had penciled small in the margins. The weights and the water and the prices in the old man's square hand, and something moved through the vaquero's weathered face that was not the town's look at all. He read a long while. Then he closed the book careful and set his hat back and asked in few words, could he stay? He did not ask after wages. Ada looked at the old man and at the poor horse and at the way the cattle had already gone quiet around him, and she said there was no money yet. Only a bet in the lean-to and a share of what the herd made when it made anything, and Delfino Reyes said that would do. And that was the whole of it, and it was everything. Because in that old man's head lived 40 years of this country's water and grass and every trick for keeping gaunt cattle alive through a dry fall that was written in no book. And now it was hers to draw on beside her father's. And that fall they needed every trick there was, because the grass on the 4 sections was thin and the drought had the whole plateau by the throat, and 37 starving cattle cannot eat water. So they fed them the country. Delfino showed her the old way with the prickly pear, and Ada took it up the way she took up everything, by doing it until her hands knew it, going out at dusk with a torch of twisted grass soaked in coal oil and singeing the spines off the pear where it grew thick along the caprock breaks, burning the needles down to a stubble so the cattle could get their tongues around the wet green pads without ruining their mouths. And the half-wild longhorn learned fast to come to the smell of the singeing thee. Way-tamer cattle come to a feed call. They gathered mesquite beans in sacks off the bottoms where the old trees hung heavy, sweet and full of feed, and spread them for the weakest. Ada bought hay when she could get it, and she could not get much. A little at a time and dear, small loads off men who would sell to her only because her money was as good as anyone's, and they thought her a fool to spend it on skeletons. And she wrote every load in the book against its price, because a herd is fed on arithmetic as much as on grass, and she meant to know to the dime what each standing head had cost her to keep standing. And when the first norther came down off the plains in the last of October, black and sudden with the temperature falling like a dropped stone, she did not lose her head, and she did not lose her cattle, because Delfino had taught her, and her father's book had told her where the draws ran deep, and she and the old vaquero and Colton pushed the herd down into the sheltered cuts below the rim where the cut banks broke the wind, and held them there bunched and warm on singed pear, and bought hay while the northers screamed over the top of the plateau and did them no harm, and in the gray morning all 37 of the marked alive were still on their feet, and Ada wrote that down too. Colton worked through all of it beside her, sullen and shamed and saying little, a proud man doing a beaten man's labor on land he had been laughed onto, and Ada did not press him, because she had a trader's patience for a thing that would come in its own season, or not at all, and she treated him the way she treated a half-wild animal in a chute, which was to leave the gap open and stand quiet in it, and let him come toward her only as far as he would that day. But she saw his watching change. She saw it the morning the old muley cow went down, the first of the 3 she had marked in the book, and Colton stood over the dead cow angry and sick with it, one more loss on a losing place, and Ada came and read the page to him flat, the page she had written the night they drove the herd home, and showed him the muley marked to fall, and the date beside it, written before the cow had staggered once. He looked at the book. Then he looked at her. And it was the first time he had looked at her as a man looks at something he has badly misjudged, and he did not say anything, but a thing behind his face shifted and did not shift back. And once that fall, Verl Ott rode up the draw to see the joke for himself, loud and crude, and sitting his good Obar horse above her fence. And he looked at the 37 ribby head on the water, and he laughed and said the county had a pool going on which would starve out first, the cattle or the woman, and that his money was on the woman lasting the longer because there was a deal more of her to render. And he laughed at his own wit and turned his horse and rode off, and all the cruelty of it stayed in his mouth where it belonged. And Ada answered him not one word, because she had learned long ago that a thing you answer with your mouth you must keep answering, and a thing you answer with your book stays answered. On the 15th day she drove into Caprock for salt and coal oil and a little flour, and the 15th day was the day Verlotte's 2 weeks came due. She had not counted on it and had not marked it, but the loafers on the mercantile step had, because a town that makes a bet remembers the terms better than the men who made them. And they watched the big Mercer woman tie her team and step up to Nella Cobb's counter with her book under her arm. Still married, still standing, the herd still hers. And one of them said, loud enough to carry, that Ott had lost his 2 weeks, and it looked like the joke might run all the way to Sloat's 3 months after all. And another laughed and said not to spend the winnings yet, that anybody could last a fortnight, and to give it till spring, that the plateau would have the both of them and every skeleton steer besides long before the grass came green again. Give it till spring. Ada bought her salt and her oil and her flour and answered them nothing, and she loaded the wagon herself and drove home under a sky gone hard and iron gray with the first real frost coming on. And that night by the lamp she opened the tally book to a fresh line, and she wrote, in the small square hand her father had drilled into her, day 15, all 37 standing, water running. She did not write down Ott's name or Ott's bet. She did not need to. The book kept its own accounting, and the day would come when every quiet line in it would prove a debt somebody rich had signed without knowing it, and would be made to pay to the letter. But that day was a long way off, and the frost was here. And she closed the book and blew out the lamp. Riding home the next dusk with Colton on the seat beside her and the frost already whitening the ruts and the breath of the team standing off them in the cold, Colton was quiet a long time. And then he asked her the first thing he had ever asked her that the bet had not put in his mouth. The first unforced question of their whole strange marriage. "Where did you learn cattle?" he said, not looking at her, looking out at the whitening flat. And Ada Mercer looked out at the same cold ground and gave him the whole of it in the only register she had, which was few words and true ones. "My father counted," she said. "I wrote." "My father counted," she said, and I wrote. And for a while there was only the creak of the wagon and the horse blowing smoke in the cold, and then, because he had asked it plain and not to bait her, she let the answer open the way a dry draw opens into bottomland, and she told him about Ezra Mercer as the road unwound toward home. Her father had been a trader, she said, not a rancher, a man who had moved through this country when it was younger than either of them, buying and selling horses and hides and cattle and whatever a hard season shook loose from men who had run out of arithmetic. And he had a gift she had never once seen in another living soul, which was that he could look at a gaunt steer in bad light and tell you what it would weigh fattened, and look at a man across a fire and tell you what he would take before the man himself had decided. And he was right so often that men called it luck, because the true word frightened them. But it was not luck, she said. It was counting. Ezra Mercer counted everything. Every head and every dollar and every mile of a drive and every day of grass a herd had eaten down, and what he could not carry in his head he set in a tally book bound in oilcloth against the weather, and the winter she turned 12, small enough still to ride in the wagon box among the flour sacks. He had put a pencil stub in her hand and taught her the writing of it, the columns and the dates and the plain flat words that did not lie, because a man's memory, he told her, takes the shape of the thing he wishes were true, but a number set down in ink, the day it happened, keeps its shape forever. And a thing that keeps its shape can be leaned on, and a thing that can be leaned on is the only wealth that outlasts a bad year. He had died with his boots off and his books squared, owing no man, and he had left her the books and the counting and nothing besides that the world would call an inheritance, and she had carried them through the dress shop, years folded flat, beneath the bolt goods, and now, she said, and did not finish it, because the wagon had come up over the last rise, and the shack stood black against the frost-white draw, with the 37 Longhorns strung below it dark as stitching, and Colton Vane said nothing at all, but she felt him counting them against the snowlight the way a man counts a thing he has only just understood he is afraid to lose. And that was the first night she let herself think that perhaps, given a winter, he might do. And the winter came for them the way it comes onto the caprock, without apology. She was up each morning before there was gray enough to see her own hands, and the first work of every day was the spring boxes. For the seeps, she and Colton had dug clean froze a skin of ice over the still water in the dark. And a longhorn will not break ice with its own muzzle for long before it quits and drifts, and a herd that quits water in cold goes down faster than a herd that quits feed. So she took the axe down to the boxes in the blue dark and chopped the ice off in slabs and let the live water show black and moving before the light came. And she did it again at noon and again at dusk. And Delfino Reyes worked the far boxes without being asked, and between them the water on Tule Draw never once closed over that whole winter, which was a thing no outfit on the plateau below could say. When the grass went under the first hard freeze and the cattle nosed at ground that had nothing left in it, she brought out the pear. The prickly pear grew thick in the rough breaks above the draw, and a starving country had learned long since that the spines were all that stood between a cow and a bellyful of it, so she made a torch of toe sacking soaked in coal oil wound on a mesquite pole. And at night, when the wind lay down, she and Colton and the old vaquero went along the breaks and singed the pear, passing the flame slow over each broad pad until the spines curled to ash and the green flesh showed blistered and sweet, and the longhorns learned the smell of it, and came up behind them in the torchlight to feed. And there was something in it, the flame and the beasts, and the three of them working the dark hillside, that Colton watched more than he worked. The hay she had bought dear in small lots through the fall she did not squander. She strung it in lines down the two sheltered draws where the caprock rim broke the north wind, forking it out thin and long so no beast could stand and guard a pile, and the weak ones got their share, feeding the way her father had written a man ought to feed in a hard country, which was to make the feed do the herding for you. And she watched the sky. When the light went flat and brassy in the north, and the cattle grew restless and bunched of their own accord, she and Colton and Delfino turned the herd down into the deep draws under the rim before the northers struck, and they stood the night watches through the worst of the blows, walking the bunched cattle slow to keep them from drifting into the wire and smothering against it. 3 dark figures and a lantern in a screaming white world, and she learned the exhaustion of a body that has not been warm since October, and did not complain of it, because the books had no column for complaint. She lost 2 head that winter. One was an old cow gone hollow-toothed that could not hold flesh however she fed her, and one was a steer that got out through a gap in the night of a bad blow and was found stiff against the fence 3 days after. And Ada did not lie about either of them, not to herself and not to the book. She wrote them down. 2 head lost, the date, the cause beside each in her small flat hand, and under it the new standing figure 35, and she underlined nothing and softened nothing, because a tally book that flatters you in a lean year will betray you in a fat one, and the whole worth of the thing was that it never lied in either direction. 35 standing. The books did not lie, which was precisely why, in a year she could not yet see, they would be weapons. Down in Caprock the town had begun to notice. It noticed the way a town notices anything, sideways and slow and out loud at the feed store, and what it noticed was that the joke had not broken. Verlotte's 2 weeks had come and gone in the mud of December with the marriage still standing, and now, in the raw end of that same season, Sloat's 3 months came due, and Ada was not there to see it, but Delfino was, buying nails, and he carried it home to her flat and dry the way he carried everything. Ephraim Sloat had made a private wager with Ott over and above the big bet on the rail, $40 between them, that the thing would come apart before Sloat's own 3-month mark. And when the 3 months passed with the dressmaker still up on Tule Draw and her 35 head standing, Sloat had to count the $40 onto the feed store counter into Verlotte's open hand, sour as green persimmon, while the loafers watched, and one of them said, not quiet enough, that maybe the joke was on the men who told it, and Sloat did not laugh, And that, Delfino said, was the first time in his hearing a Caprock man had failed to laugh at Ada Mercer. She noted the date beside the standing count, because her father had taught her that the day a thing turns is a fact like any other and belongs in the book with the rest. Spring came up green and sudden off the Caprock, the way it does after a hard winter that has been paid for in full, and with it came the calves. She had bred nothing and hoped for nothing extravagant, for a starved cow throws late and light, but the water and the pear and the strung hay had carried her cows through in better flesh than any man would have bet on, and they dropped their calves down in the sheltered draws through a warm, wet April, and she counted them onto the ground one at a time as they came and wrote each one down. And when the last cow had calved and the count was steady, she read it out to Colton across the fire, 19 calves on the ground, and every one of them living. 19, he said the number back to her, quiet, the way a man says a figure he intends to keep. And when the calves were strong enough, she held the branding, and that was the day she made the brand real. Her father had drawn it once, years back, an M standing over a straight bar. The M for the name and the bar for the flat country he had traded across and never owned a foot of. And he had drawn it in the back of the tally book with the fee to file it and the office it must go to written beside. And then he had died before he ever rode to the clerk with the money. So the brand had lived all those years as a drawing and nothing more, a thing his hand had made and his life had not reached. Ada took it to the county clerk in Caprock the week after branding, and she paid the fee out of the dress shop money that was left, and she stood at the counter while the clerk dipped his pen and copied the M over bar into the brand book and wrote her name beside it, Ada Mercer, in the owner's column, and stamped the page with the county seal and inked a receipt and slid it across, receipt number, date, the brand drawn small in the corner, the fee, the clerk's initials, and she folded it and put it in the oilcloth book with her father's drawing facing the county's copy of it. The thing he had made and the thing she had at last made real. And she carried it home, and that night she wrote in the book, brand of record, M over bar, filed in the date, and it was the first receipt, and she knew it for what it was even then. The first sheet of paper in a country that ran on paper. The first thing no man could argue with. That summer she learned the market the way her father had learned everything, by standing quiet where men talked and saying little. The army post at Fort Elliott let a beef contract, and the contractor who held it, a heavy-freighted man named Cobb, bought not only from the big outfits but from anyone who could deliver a clean sublot to the post scale, and Ada listened at the wagon yard until she understood the whole shape of it, the weight the army wanted, the miles of the drive the day the scale opened. She picked 12 of her biggest steers and put them on the tool bottoms where the grass ran green and heavy along the wet ground and let them lay on flesh 6 weeks, and when Cobb rode out to look at them, he ran his eye over the 12 and offered her $22 a head, and said it the way such men say it to a woman. As a kindness she had not the sense to price. Ada did not raise her voice. She took the tally book off the wagon seat, and she read him his own trade back to him out loud. The weight those steers would carry fat as they were, the shrink they would lose over the drive miles to Fort Elliott, what that left on the Army scale the morning it opened, and the price the Army paid the hundredweight, which she had also written down, and she did the arithmetic aloud, one figure onto the next, until the number at the bottom of it was $34 a head, and there was nothing in the sum a man could argue with, because every piece of it was his own. Cobb looked at her a while. He paid the 34. 12 steers at $34, and she did not put the money in a tin behind a stove. She rode straight from the post to a busted outfit south of the breaks that was selling off, and she bought 28 yearling heifers cheap off a man who needed cash worse than he needed cattle, and drove them home in the dust, because her father had written that money standing still is money dying, and money turned into young breeding. Stock in a country with grass and water is money that counts itself. And in the middle of that summer, with the marriage half a year old, Dunstan Pryor rode up to the spring. His 6 months had come due, and where Ott had jeered and Sloat had paid, Pryor came himself, easy on a good horse, to see with his own flat eyes why the thing he had bet against had not fallen. He sat his horse at the head of Tule Draw and looked a long while at the water running clean out of the boxes she had dug, and at the calves fat in the draw, and he took his hat off to her, which none of them ever had, and he complimented the water. He said it was the finest water on the plateau, said it the slow, admiring way a man praises a thing not because he loves it, but because he has already decided to own it. And then he offered, gentle as pouring cream, to buy the whole outfit, land and water and cattle and brand, at a fair figure and a little over, before, he said. This country broke her the way it had broken stronger backs than hers. Ada looked at him from the ground, with her hand flat on the cool, wet stone of the nearest spring box. "The water is not for sale," she said, "nor the land under it, nor anything that drinks from it." Pryor smiled the whole time, and the smile did not change when she said it, but something behind his eyes went to arithmetic, and he put his hat back on and said that winter was long in this country, and turned his good horse down off the draw, and she watched him grow small on the flat and knew she had made an enemy who would keep the patient kind, and she wrote the date of his visit in the book beside the water. Something turned in Colton that summer, too, though he was a while letting it show. For the better part of a month he kept his own count against hers, tallying the herd on a scrap of paper in his shirt, checking her figures the way a man checks a thing he half hopes to catch out, and then one evening she saw he had quit. And when she asked, he said only that hers was always righter, and there was no sense keeping two books when one was true. And that was as near as he came to saying he trusted her. Then he rode into Caprock and got into a fight at the feed store over a joke some man made about the dressmaker and her cows, came home with his knuckles split and his lips swelled and a kind of shamed pride on him, waiting for her to be glad of it, and she was not glad of it. She cleaned the split on his hand, and she told him plainly, not unkindly, that she did not need her name defended with his fists. That a name defended in a fight is a name still up for argument, and what she needed was her name banked, written in a ledger and stamped on a receipt where no man's opinion could reach it. And if he wanted to spend himself on her behalf, he could spend it on the water, and the count, and the paper, because those were the only things in this country that stayed one. He looked at her a long moment with his swelled lip, and then he nodded slow, and the next morning he was at the spring boxes before her with the axe already swinging, and he never lifted his hand in a Caprock Street on her account again. And in September the year was up. They rode into Caprock together the morning it came due, into the stockman's bank where Ambrose Teal had drawn the terms of the wager into a proper instrument, the way such men make even a bar rail bet respectable once money stands behind it, and the three of them were there, Sloat and Ott and Pryor, to make good on the thing they had staked. The dying scrap of ground called Tule Draw they had thrown at a doomed marriage to seal a joke, and now the year had run, and the marriage stood, and the deed had to change hands. Ott signed the transfer sneering, a man handing over a thing he had never believed he would lose and could not quite believe was worth having. Sloat signed it sour and silent. The $40 from the winter still stuck in him. Pryor signed it smiling, and the smile was the worst of the three, because a man who smiles paying a debt is a man who has already priced getting it back. Ambrose Teal witnessed the deed and passed it across, and it was Ada's, the land free and clear, that had been staked against her and won. And then Colton did the thing that told the town more than any fight in the street ever had. He took the deed up off the banker's desk, and he carried it across the square to the county clerk's office, with the whole street watching through the glass. And he laid it on the counter and had it recorded, and when the clerk asked in whose name, Colton said, in both, and he had the clerk write Ada Mercer Vane in the book beside his own name. Her name first, on the deed to the ground she had made worth owning, and he paid the recording fee himself and stood while it was stamped. The clerk inked them a copy, the deed of record, both names, the county seal, the date, and Ada folded it into the oilcloth satchel with her father's books, and the brand receipt, and the bill of sale for the steers, and everything else the year had written. And that night, if she had done her sums aloud by the fire, the count would have run like this: That 37 starving head the whole town had laughed at had come through a killing winter and a green spring and a summer of trading and stood now, calves and heifers and market money turned into breeding stock, at 82 head running under or following the Mercer brand. Up from 37 the day they laughed, and every one of them written down. 82. She and Colton stepped out of the clerk's office into the hard bright noon of the square with the recorded deed heavy in the book satchel against her hip, and the light after the dim office was the kind that makes a person stop a moment on a threshold, and it was in that moment, blinking into the glare, that she saw Dunstan Pryor across the street, standing easy in the shade of the mercantile awning where he had been waiting, watching the clerk's window, and as she watched, he pushed off the post with his shoulder and stepped down into the street and started toward them, unhurried, through the slow midday tangle of wagons and teams. Dunstan Pryor came across the street the way he came at everything, without hurry, letting the wagon traffic bend around him rather than quickening a step for it, and he touched his hat brim to Ada Mercer Vane on the boardwalk outside the clerk's office with the ease of a man who had never once in his life been made to wait on what he wanted. Colton went a little stiff at her shoulder, the deed satchel hanging between them heavy with the morning's recording, but Ada did not go stiff at all. She had learned long ago that a man who takes his time coming toward you is telling you something before he ever opens his mouth, and so she stood easy in the bright September light and let him arrive. "Mrs. Vane," he said, and the courtesy in it was genuine, and that was the whole danger of the man. "I hear the county set the Thule draw down in both your names this morning. That's a fine piece of bottom ground." "My congratulations." "Thank you," Ada said, and then she said nothing else, because Ezra Mercer had taught her at his elbow with a tally book open between them that the party who speaks second in any dealing gives up the least, and she had never once in 20 years forgotten it. Pryor smiled his flat smile and looked out at the street a moment as though the thing he had come to say had only just that instant occurred to him. "I'll be plain, since folks tell me you're a plain-dealing woman," he said. "Beef soft this year, and going softer. A man reads the Kansas City sheets of a morning, and a man frets. I'd buy you out, the draw, the brand, the whole little outfit of yours, at a fair price, a generous price even, while fair prices are still to be had." And there it was, laid down soft on the boardwalk between them like a folded banknote, and Ada heard the whole of it the way she could hear a false column the moment a clerk read it aloud. While fair prices are still to be had, a man does not trouble to warn a widow that fair prices are ending unless he already knows the reason they will end, and knows it from the inside, and cannot stop the knowing from leaking out around the edges of a kindness. She had ridden the flat below the caprock all that spring with the tally book across the saddlebow, and she had counted what no one down in Caprock troubled to count. The open range was double-stocked and past it. Pryor and Harmon Sloat and Ott had every one of them gone to the Fort Worth banks and borrowed against a beef price that no longer existed, and put the borrowed money into more cattle on grass that belonged to nobody. Thousands of head crowding the same free flats and chewing the buffalo grass to the crown, while the market for what they fattened slid lower with every train that left. Pryor was not offering to rescue her from a soft market. He was standing in the middle of a thing he had helped build and had just begun to understand he could not get back out of, and he wanted her water and her hay ground under him before the floor gave way. "The outfit is not for sale," Ada said, in the same tone she might have used to tell him the time, "nor the draw, nor the brand, nor the water." She let the last word sit a moment. "But I thank you for the warning, Mr. Pryor. A body should always listen close when a neighbor tells her prices are about to fall." Something moved behind his eyes and then went still, the arithmetic of it, and he touched his hat again and said winter was long and turned back into the traffic. And Ada watched him go and then took Colton's arm and walked to the wagon, and that was the last easy conversation anyone in Caprock had with Dunstan Pryor for a year and a half. That was the whole of the summer's warning, and Ada Mercer Vane spent the summer of 1885 doing the one thing with it that not another soul on the plateau thought to do. She spent every dollar she could raise on hay. It looked like lunacy, and she did it anyway, because the tally book did not lie, and the tally book said a double-stocked range in a dry country was a wager against the sky, and the sky always collected. She rode to the settler farms strung along the wet draws east of the escarpment, where the little dry land families were failing one after another on their quarter sections, and she bought their standing meadow cuts on the stalk, the tall slow grass, and the wild timothy in the seep bottoms, paying cash where cash had gone scarce as hen's teeth, and she hired the settlers themselves and their horse-drawn mowing machines to cut it and rake it and stack it. She contracted 3 families with mowers and paid them fair day wages that they had not seen in 2 seasons. And she put Colton and Delfino to hauling, and load by load through the long hot months she moved the country's grass off the low ground and stacked it where the wind could not have it. She stacked it in the lee of the caprock draws, in the deep sheltered mouths where the escarpment broke down into the tulle bottoms, ton upon ton of it. Long-topped ricks built the old, careful way with the crowns combed down to shed the weather, until the draws behind the tulle looked like a strange new town had grown up in them overnight, a town made all of hay. And while she stacked, she fenced. Lem Hewitt had gone broke 2 winters before them and left his forfeited sections and coiled and rusting in his fallen-in barn. Most of a mile of the new barbed wire that had ruined him, bought on credit for a range war he never got to fight, and Ada bought the wire off the bank for pennies on the pound and had Delfino and the Hewitt boys string it. She did not fence a pasture with it. She strung drift fences, short stubborn lines of it laid clean across the open mouths of the draws. Wings of wire angled, so that anything driven south before a norther would fetch up gentle against her ground instead of drifting on past it into the flats to die. It was a small thing and a strange thing, and the whole town made a joke of it. The dressmakers' haystacks, they called them at the feed store and on the church steps, and it was Ott who carried the cruelty of it. Ott, who leaned on the stockyard rail and told anyone who would stand still that the big Mercer woman had traded a good dress trade for a career in the hay business, that a body could always tell a greenhorn because a greenhorn spends good money in July storing up winter for cattle she does not even own yet. And the men laughed, because it was easy to laugh, and because Ada gave them nothing back but a nod as she drove past with another load, and it went on all summer long. Then autumn came, and the market did what the tally book had said it would do. Beef broke. It did not slide any more. It fell, the Kansas City sheets coming in worse each week, and the borrowed men who had crowded the free grass all summer discovered in the space of a single month that they owed the Fort Worth banks against cattle that would no longer bring the price of the note. And they did the only thing a cornered borrower can do, which is to sell whatever he can lay hands on to raise cash before the paper comes due. They dumped cattle. Pryor and Sloat and Ott and every over-mortgaged outfit on the plateau drove their thin surplus into the caprock pens and sold, and with everyone selling at once and no one buying, the price went through the floor and out the bottom of it. Good young stock going for $8 a head in the pens that had brought 25 in the spring and would bring 25 again the first green year that followed. $8. Ada stood at the pen rails through the whole of that panic with a tally book open on the top board and a stub of pencil behind her ear, and she bought. She did not buy the way a man buys in a falling market, snatching whole lots on a shout because they are cheap. She bought the way her father had taught her to buy anything, one animal at a time and with her hands. She went down into the pens in her plain dark dress with her sleeves turned back and put her hands on them, feeling along the spine and over the hip for the bone under the winter hair, reading the young sound cows out from the culls, the deep-bodied heifers that would breed back, the steers with frame enough to lay on flesh the moment grass came again, and each one she chose she set down in the book with the price paid and the seller's name, a bill of sale for every head, while Delfino and Colton trailed them home, lot by lot, along the Caprock Road. She bought other men's ruin at $8 and drove it up into ground she had spent all summer stocking with hay, and by the time the pens emptied out at the tail of that terrible autumn, the count in the tally book had climbed to 430 head standing under or following the Mercer brand, up from the 82 she had carried out of the summer, up from the 37 that the whole county had laughed her into buying 2 years before. And the whole county laughed again, harder than ever, because now the joke had a number on it. 400 head, they said at the feed store. That fool woman has gone and bought 400 head with winter coming and no range under them worth the name. She'll be feeding 400 head of dead men's cattle on snow by January. And Ada Mercer Vane, hauling the last of the bought stock home in the short cold light of December, would have told them, had any one of them troubled to ask her, instead of laughing, that this was exactly, precisely, to the head, what she intended to do. The norther came down out of the northwest on the 9th of January in the year 1886, and it came the way the killing storms come onto that high country, with no soft beginning to it at all. The morning had that hard, brassy light, and then the light went out of the sky like a snuffed lamp, and the wind backed around into the north and rose and kept rising. And the first snow came sidewise and dry as sand, and did not stop coming for 3 days, and the better part of a fourth. It was the great die-up, the winter the southern plains would count their dead by for a generation after, and it found the open range exactly as Ada had known it would, double-stocked, grazed to the dirt. The thin, borrowed cattle standing tailed up to the wind with nothing in their bellies to break the cold, drifting south in their thousands, because a cow will always drift before a norther, walking blind and downwind until something stops her. Ada's outfit did not stand and wait for it. They had been waiting for it since July. When the light went wrong, she had them in the saddle, and the 4 of them, Ada and Colton and Delfino and the Hewitt boy who had come to her, broke and stayed on for wages, gathered the whole 430 head down off the exposed benches and into the deep tool draws under the Caprock lee, into the sheltered mouths where the wind broke against the escarpment and went over the top of them instead of through them, and where her hay stood ricked and waiting. And then they went to work, and the work did not stop for 3 days. Ada ran it the way she ran a page of figures, steady and in order, and by feel when the snow took the seeing away. They ran the hay in lines, forking it down off the ricks into long windrows the cattle could walk and feed along without bunching and smothering the weak ones, and when the dark and the driving snow made a lantern useless, they ran the lines by feel, hand to rick to sled to windrow and back, the same path so many times their bodies knew it without their eyes. They kept the water open, chopping the creek ice clear with axes morning and dark and midday, because a cow that cannot drink will not eat, and a cow that will not eat cannot make the heat to live. And the cold sealed it again almost as fast as they cut it. Ada took the worst of it herself, and did not seem to feel it, planted in the wind at the mouth of the main draw where the whole thing turned, a big, unshakable dark shape in a man's canvas coat, with the snow caking white down one whole side of her, turning the cattle, reading the drift, sending Delfino here and the boy there, and Colton to the far rick, with a word or a lifted arm. And where a slighter body would have been staggered off its feet and driven downwind, she simply stood, low and broad and rooted, the one still thing in all that howling motion, and the cattle drifted to her the way frightened things drift to the only steadiness they can find. They lost almost nothing. A few of the weakest of the bought stock went down and did not get up, and Ada wrote each one in the book honestly, the way she wrote everything, because the books do not lie, and a woman who lies in her own tally has already lost. But the herd lived, 400 and better, sheltered and fed and watered through the whole of the great die-up, while out on the open flats beyond her drift fences the range died. It died in the thousands, and the narrator will not dwell on it, save to say what Ada saw when the wind finally fell on the 4th day and she rode her outside wire, that the borrowed cattle of the plateau had drifted south before the storm exactly as a cow will, mile on mile, until the foremost of them fetched up against the barbed drift fences she had strung across the draw mouths in July. And there they had stopped, and there the cold had taken them where they stood, and the snow had drifted them over. She had built those fences to catch her own, and instead they had caught the whole country's dying. And she sat her horse a long moment in the terrible white quiet, and then she turned back to her living herd and did not speak of it. The losses of the barons came into Caprock the way such news always comes, in whispers first, and then in numbers. Sloat had lost better than half. Ott, who had leaned on the stockyard rail all summer naming her a greenhorn, had lost near to half his herd. Whole draws of his cattle drifted dead against other men's fences 40 miles south, and Ott did not lean on the rail and talk any more. And when the snow went off and the ground came clear and the spring branding came round in that year of 1886, Ada Mercer Vane ran her whole herd through the chute and tallied them by her own hand as they came, and the number she wrote at the bottom of the page and then said once, out loud to Colton across the branding fire, was 412 head alive. 412, wintered through the worst storm the plateau had ever counted, when men who had laughed at her haystacks were riding the flats picking hides off the wire. And the laughter in Caprock went quiet, and then it went uneasy, the way a room goes when a joke turns out to have been true all along and pointed the wrong direction. Dunstan Pryor rode out to her branding uninvited that spring and sat his horse at the edge of the fire and watched the Mercer iron go on calf after calf. And he did not offer to buy anything, and he did not touch his hat and make a kindness of it. He only sat and watched and did his sums behind those flat still eyes, counting her living herd against his dead one. And after a while he turned and rode back toward the /P without a word, and Ada let him go and did not stop her count. And down in town the world had begun, quietly, to shift its weight. Ambrose Teal, who ran the Stockman's Bank and had for 2 years called her the Vane woman when he called her anything, now came out from behind his rail to meet her at the door and called her Mrs. Vane, and then simply Ada, because a bank knows to the dollar which of its depositors it can afford to be cold to, and the Mercer account had stopped being the kind a bank is cold to and become the kind a bank walks out from behind its rail to greet. And there was one thing more, small against 412 head, but not small to Ada. On the last night of the storm, come in soot-black and snow-burned and hollow-eyed by the fire in the draw, Colton had looked at her across the low flames a long moment. And something in him had finished settling that had been settling for a year and a half, and from that night on he took her orders plain and easy in front of the other men and never once flinched at the taking. Would say the boss wants the north lot moved to Delfino without a hitch in it, deference worn open where any man could see it, and that was as near to a courtship as the two of them came that year, and it was enough. Then the green came up over the burned country the way it always does after a hard winter, quick and tender and false, and Ada watched the sky for the rain that ought to follow it, and the rain did not come. The green up came and stood, and then began to cure on the stalk while it was still April, the grass going off before its time, and the sky over the Caprock turned that same hard, brassy dry that she had learned to read, day on cloudless day of it, the country tipping straight out of its killing winter and down into a drought without so much as a wet week between. And Ada Mercer Vane, who had spent one summer learning that the sky always collects, and one winter proving it, saddled a fresh horse in the cool of a dry spring morning with the current tally book buttoned into her coat, and rode east along the rim of the escarpment, alone, at a walk, stopping at every place the ground broke down and the water came up. Counting. She counted the live springs one by one, and the seeps below them, the little ceaseless cold flows that no drought had touched yet, and that the whole burned plateau would be crawling toward before the summer was out, and beside each one she wrote in the book what it ran and where it lay. And then she wrote the one thing that mattered more than either, the thing she had ridden out to learn. Who owned the ground the water came up on? And beside spring after spring after spring, all down that 30 miles of dry rim in her own plain slanting hand, she wrote the same word. Nobody. The rim ran on east ahead of her the way a seam runs down a length of cloth, and Ada Mercer wrote it slow through the brassy dry light of that spring. the current tally book open across the horn of her saddle, and a stub of lead pencil going steady in her cold fingers, and everywhere the escarpment sweated water she drew rein, and got down, and looked, and wrote. She had come out of the branding grounds, and off the home sections, and up onto the rim alone, with a canteen and a cold biscuit and nothing else she meant to spend, because what she had ridden 30 miles to gather could not be bought with money and cost nothing at all to a woman willing to take the trouble to count it. And she counted. At the head of the first draw there was a live spring, cold and small and ceaseless, welling up under a lip of caprock into a green pocket of sedge no bigger than the floor of her old dress shop. And she went down on one knee and put her flat hand into it and felt it run against her palm, and she wrote it in the book, Live Spring, head of the north draw, still runs in August by the moss on it, and then beside it, in the same slanting hand her father Ezra had drilled into her before she was 12 years old, she wrote the thing that mattered more than the water itself. State School Land. Unowned, unfenced, she got back up on the horse and rode on. A mile east there was a seep in the bottom of a tool flat. No spring at all, but the ground gone dark and spongy where the water lay close under it, and the tools stood green and rank in the middle of a country already curing brown, and she wrote that too, and wrote unowned beside it, and unfenced. There was a second spring behind a slab of fallen rimrock that a man could ride past for 10 years and never know was there. And she knew it was there, because she had listened to Delfino talk about this country by the stove of a winter evening the way she listened to everyone, storing it, and she found it exactly where an old vaquero's 40 years had said it would be, and she wrote it down. All that long day she rode the escarpment, and the book filled, spring by seep by tool bottom, 9 live waters in the first 15 miles, and 11 more in the second 15, and beside every last one of them the same 3 words stood in her pencil like a fence line already surveyed. Unowned, unfenced, State School Land. And somewhere in the middle of that dry, hot afternoon, with the sky the color of a scorched skillet and the grass on the open range going brittle under the horse's feet, Ada Mercer understood the whole of the thing at last. Understood it the way you understand a sum when the last figure drops into the column and the total sits there plain and cannot be argued with, which was that the empire she was building was not made of grass and it was not made of cattle. It was made of water. Grass was only as good as the water that grew it and the wire that held it, and a man could own 40,000 acres of open range and be a beggar in a dry year, and a woman could own the 20 little places the water came out of the ground and own, in every way that finally counted, all the range between them. Her father had kept his tally books to know what a thing was worth before he paid for it. She had just found the cheapest thing in Texas that year and the dearest, both at once, and it was lying out on the open bench under nobody's name, waiting for the one person on the plateau who had thought to count it. Now, if this story has taken hold of you, subscribe to this channel and stay with me clear to the last word, and drop the name of your town in the comments below, because I mean to see just how far Ada's story travels tonight, and I promise you this, that what she did next will change everything you thought you knew about who really holds the power in a country. And it was not the men on the fence rail. She rode down off the rim in the last of the light with a full book, and she did not go home. She went to town. The land office at Caprock was a hot little room with a rail across it, and a clerk who did not much like being made to work at the end of a day, and Ada Mercer sat down across that rail with her tally book and the blizzard year profits banked at Ambrose Teal Stockman's Bank standing behind her like a wall, and she filed. She filed the way the state of Texas had lately made it possible for anyone with grit and a little cash to file, under the School Land Act. On section after section of the public free school ground, the state was selling off the top of that plateau at $1 and $2 the acre, a small part down in cash, and the rest carried by the state itself on long low-interest notes a patient owner could pay out over years, and Ada Mercer, who had read every line of that act by lamplight twice through, filed on the sections that held her water. Not the grass. Nobody had to buy the grass. She filed on the quarter sections and the odd surveyed pieces that had a live spring in them, or a seep, or the green throat of a tool draw. 20 small, deliberate blocks of ground scattered 30 miles along the escarpment like buttons sewn down a bodice, and each one of them, cheap and alkali and worthless to every cowman who had ever loped past it, turned the free range around it into her own the instant the fence went up, because the cattle that grazed that range had to drink. And now they could only drink where Ada Mercer let them. And she was not done in the land office. She walked across the street into the Stockman's Bank, where Ambrose Teal now rose from his chair when she came through the door, and she bought out Lem Hewitt's forfeited paper altogether. The 2 good sections of caprock draw that the bank had taken back when the Baron's glut ruined Hewitt the year before. The very sections whose old wire she had strung into her first drift fences. Bought them clean and outright with her own money, so that the ground she had already been using on sufferance was hers on paper now, recorded, stamped, and safe. Teal counted her draft twice and looked at her over his spectacles a long moment, and what had been in his face 2 winters back when she traded a dress shop for 37 dying Longhorns was gone out of it entirely, and something careful had come in its place. Then came the wire. She freighted it up the caprock grade in wagon loads, spool on heavy spool of the new barbed wire the drummers were selling all over Texas that year, and she freighted up the cedar posts behind it. And she did the other thing then that was the true engine of the whole play. The thing that cost her money and bought her something money does not usually buy. She hired the broken men. The glut the barons had made, dumping cheap cattle on a sinking market to crowd the free grass with their borrowed herds, had ruined the small outfits all around the plateau the same way it had ruined Lem Hewitt, and there were men in that country now, with a saddle and a rope and a family and no cattle left under them and no wages coming in, proud men gone hollow-eyed and quiet. The kind of men a town stops looking straight at. Ada Mercer hired them. She hired Lem Hewitt himself and his grown boy, and she hired the 2 Farrell brothers who had lost their place on the North Fork, and she hired a half-dozen more as the fencing went on, and she paid them a fair day's wage in hard money on the day it was earned, not scrip, not credit at a store she owned, but coin, and she fed them at a long table, and she did not once, in front of any man or behind his back, remind them what they had been the season before. She set them to building fence. All that spring and into the burning summer of 1886, the crews worked out along the escarpment, digging post holes in ground like fired brick, stretching the shining wire tight from spring to spring and draw to draw, fencing not the whole of her range. A body could not fence the whole of that range, and did not need to, but fencing the water, throwing a tight wire ring around every live spring and every green seep and every tool bottom in the book, so that the free grass stayed free and open the way the law and the custom of the country said it must. And the water in the middle of it stopped being anybody's the moment her gate swung shut. And the broken men who built that fence became, without a word ever being said about it, her men. They had been paid fair when no one else would pay them at all, fed when they were hungry, spoken to like hands and not like charity, and a man remembers who stood him up when he was down, remembers it in his bones, and Ada Mercer had just banked the deepest loyalty there is, the kind you cannot buy from a man who has never been broke, and she had banked it 30 men wide across the whole plateau while the barons were still laughing. And through the whole of it ran the paper, because paper was the craft her father had left her, and paper was the thing she trusted the way other people trusted powder. Every section she filed on, every deed she bought, she carried herself to the county clerk's office the same day it was signed, and stood at the counter and watched the clerk enter it into the great book and press the county stamp down onto it wet, and turn it and blot it, and she took her recorded copy away folded flat and put it where it belonged. And there was a rhythm to it that summer that she came to love the way she had loved the running of a good seam, the scratch of the pen, the thump of the stamp, the ink drying brown, the clerk's tired signature, her own name written out plain and permanent in the record of the county where no man's laughter could reach it. And she did the last careful thing, the thing that was pure Ezra Mercer, which was to keep 2 books. She kept the working tally book that rode on her saddle horn and went where she went, and every quarter she copied it clean into a second, a fair duplicate of every head bought and branded, every deed, every wage paid, and every dollar owed. And she carried that second book down to the stockman's bank and lodged it in Ambrose Teal's vault behind the iron door, so that if the shack ever burned, or the saddle book was ever lost or taken, the whole of what she had built stood, proved and safe, under the bank's own lock, in her own hand with the dates on it. She was building the empire twice. Once in wire and beef out on the bench, and once in ink and stamps in the county book and the bank vault, and the second building was the one that could never be run off or cut down or burned, and she knew it, and that was why she never let the pencil rest. The barons laughed. Of course they laughed. It was the only tune they knew for her. Word ran down off the bench and around the plateau that the dressmaker had gone and spent her lucky winter's money buying the alkali, buying the worthless sour seep ground and the tool mud holes no common would run a steer across. Fencing water nobody wanted with wire she'd freighted up at her own cost, and putting Lem Hewitt and a pack of busted nesters on wages to do it. Verlot carried the joke the loudest, the way Ott carried every cruelty, telling it in the saloon with his thumbs in his vest that the fat seamstress had fenced herself a kingdom of mud and hired the county's failures to guard it, and there was hard laughter at that, and Harmon Sloat laughed along, and even Pryor's flat, careful mouth bent at the corner. She bought the alkali, they said, all that spring, and slapped the bar. She bought the alkali. And then it did not rain. The green-up of the die-up spring had come and gone, and no rain followed it, none in May and none in June, and the sky stayed that scorched skillet color week on week, and the wind came hot out of the south and stole what little the ground had and the open range of the plateau. The free grass the barons had double-stocked with their borrowed thousands went from brown to gray to nothing, cured off to dust and stubble with the cattle walking it thin and bawling. And along the escarpment, inside 20 rings of shining new wire, Ada Mercer's springs still ran, and her seeps still lay dark, and her tool bottoms stood green and rank and cool in the middle of a dying country, and the grass around each water, rested and watered and fenced, stayed the one green thing on all that high plateau. The laughter stopped. It did not turn to anything else at first, it just stopped, the way a room goes quiet, and the barons rode out to look at what they had laughed at, and sat their horses on the rim above her fenced draws and did their arithmetic behind their eyes. And the arithmetic did not come out the way it used to. She had not bought the alkali. She had bought the water, and in a drought year the water was the whole of the plateau, and they had helped her get it cheap by laughing while she filed. One night that summer, somebody answered her the only way beaten pride knows how to answer. She rode her north line at dawn and found the wire cut clean with a nipper, 4 spans of it, every strand parted neat, and the whole of it laid down flat on the ground, so her cattle would drift, and the water would go open again to whatever range stock could reach it before she found the gap. No man's name was spoken. None had to be. Everyone on the plateau knew, the way everyone always knows, and half the country waited to see whether the seamstress would come apart or come shooting. She did neither. Ada Mercer answered the cut wire the way she answered everything, with paper and not with powder. She put the Hewitt boy and the Pharaohs on it and had the north line rebuilt inside 2 days, and built double where it had been cut, 2 wires where there had been 1, and the post set deeper. Then she rode to Caprock and brought the county attorney back up the grade himself, a careful young man named Holloway, and walked him out to the laid-down wire and had him look at the cut ends with his own eyes and see that no steer's horn and no falling rock had done that it was nippers, deliberate, a man's clean work in the dark, and she reminded him, because she had read it the way she read everything, that the state of Texas had made the cutting of a lawful fence a felony in the year 1884, after the fence wars, a penitentiary crime and no longer a neighbor's mischief. And then she did the thing that frightened the men who had done it more than any gun could have. She wrote it down. She had Holloway note the date and the place and the manner of the cut, And she folded his memorandum and the tally of the damage into the book, and she closed the book, and she waited. She did not accuse a soul. She simply gathered the evidence with clean hands and let it lie in the pages the way a woman lays by preserves against a winter she knows is coming. And every man who had a notion who'd swung those nippers understood that the seamstress was not going to fight him in the dark where he was strong. She was going to fight him in the daylight, in a courthouse, in ink, where she had never once lost. And after that, the wire stayed up. Then the drought did her collecting for her, and it collected harder than any hired crew could have. The broke outfits began to come to her, because there was nowhere else on the plateau to come. They came in ones and twos up the Capra grade, men who had laughed the spring before, hats already in their hands, asking would she buy, would she take stock, would she let a starving herd at her water for the love of God and a fair price. And Ada Mercer, who had learned from her father that mercy and arithmetic are not enemies when a book is kept honest, bought them out at the bone cheap prices a drought makes, choosing cow by cow with her hand on the ribs and the tally going in the book. And where a man could not bear to sell outright, she took his cattle in on shares, feeding and watering them against a written cut of the increase, her brand or the running of them hers, either way. The count climbed. It had stood at 412 head alive off the killing winter, and now through that dry summer it climbed past 600, and past 1,000, and past 1,500. And by the time the grass began to cure for good, it stood over 2,000 head owned or run-on shares under the Mercer brand, 2,000 from 37 in 3 years. And for the first time in the whole of it, Ada Mercer was no longer a woman asking the plateau for a price. She was the woman who named it. She leased her grass and her water out at a rate she set and wrote in her own hand in the book, so much a head by the month, payable in cash or in cattle at her count, and there was no arguing it and no other water to go to. And one hot still evening at the end of that summer Harmon Sloat rode up to her home gate with his fine herd bawling for water along her outside wire behind him. And he got down off his horse, and he took off his hat, and he held it against his chest with both hands the way a man holds his hat at a graveside, and he asked Ada Mercer would she let his cattle at her water, and what would it cost him. She told him the price in her book, and he paid it, the first down payment, though neither of them said so out loud. On the 3 months he had once bet Colton Vane could not stay married to her, an IOU 3 years old come due at last in a hat held against a chest. And somewhere in all of that, small and easy to miss, the other thing had been happening too. The thing the Empire never stopped long enough to name. Colton Vane had taken to calling her Boss. He said it first out at the fence one evening, plain and unthinking Boss, the wires short at the East Gap, the way a hand says it to the outfit's owner, and he said it before any of the hired men did. And after that, they all said it. But he had said it first. He rode where she pointed, and he worked what she wrote in the book, and he had long since stopped being the town joke married to the dressmaker and become, without any fuss about it, the foreman of the biggest thing on the plateau, and glad of it. And once, only once, at the fence line at dusk, with the light going gold and long across her green fenced draw and the cattle watering quiet below them, he reached over while she was writing in the book and tucked a loose strand of her hair, blown out under the brim of her hat by the hot wind, back up under the brim where it belonged. One motion, careful, his rough hand not lingering, and then he picked up the stretcher and went back to the wire, and neither of them said a word about it. And Ada Mercer wrote down the count, and did not smile where he could see it, and felt something settle in her chest that had nothing to do with cattle. But the plateau's arithmetic went on doing its cold work whether anyone smiled or not, and the hardest sum of that whole dry year was being written 30 miles north on the /P, where the proudest of the 3 men who had laughed on the fence rail 3 years back was making the mistake that pride always makes in a drought. Pryor would not sell. He had the most cattle and the most range and the most name of any man in the country, and he held his great overstocked herd on the burning grass through the whole dry summer on nothing but pride, sure that the rain would come, because it always had, sure that a man of his standing did not scatter his herd cheap and go begging at a seamstress's gate. And when the grass gave out under him and the notes came due, he did the thing a proud man does last of all and worst of all. He went to the stockman's bank and he borrowed against the ranch itself. And Ambrose Teal took the mortgage on the /P, the whole of it, land and brand and cattle, into his vault behind the iron door. And Ada Mercer, when the word of it reached her the way all words reached her, did not say anything at all. She only opened the book and wrote it down, the fact and the date, and let it lie there on the page, with the cut-wire memorandum and the deeds and the 2,000 head, and she knew the weight of what that paper was, and did not need to announce it. Because a woman who has kept a tally book since she was 12 knows exactly what a mortgage on a dying man's pride is worth, and what it will be worth by spring. And then, early that year and mean, the snow came. It came the first week it had any business coming, and a good deal harder. The first storm of the winter of 1886 and 1887 rolling gray and low down out of the north, with a wind ahead of it that laid the cured grass flat, and it fell on the plateau the way judgment falls, without asking who was ready. It fell on Ada Mercer's stacked hay, standing in long dark loaves in the lee of the Caprock draws. Ton on ton of it put up against exactly this. It fell on her gathered herds, 2,000 head and better, drifted in tight under the Caprock lee where the springs ran open and the wire held and the hay lines waited. And off to the north, out on the open range where the grass was gone to dust under the snow and no hay stood anywhere and no shelter, waited. Harmon Sloat's cattle and Pryor's great mortgaged herd had already begun to drift before the wind, heads down, tails to the north, walking blind before the storm the way range cattle walk, drifting south and south across the dying open country until they came up against the one thing on all that plateau that would stop them. The tight new wire of Ada Mercer's outside fence, strung spring to spring along the escarpment, holding, and the snow came the way the old men had always said the worst of it would come. Not with a wind at the first of it, but with a stillness. The flakes falling straight and fat and soundless out of a sky the color of wood ash, settling on her stacked hay and her gathered herds and her doubled wire until the whole of the plateau lay white. Anne hushed and looked, for 1 hour near dark, almost gentle. Ada Mercer did not trust the gentle of it. She had read her father's weather notes in Book 1 until she knew them the way other women knew hymns, the way Ezra Mercer had marked the killing winters back to before she was born with that small, even hand of his, and she knew that a norther which came in quiet came in worst. And so she was already horseback in the last of that false calm, riding the sheltered draws with Delfino a length behind her, checking the hay lines she had freighted and laid down all through the autumn the town had laughed at. Then, near midnight, the norther found the rim of the Caprock, and the stillness tore open. The wind came down off the high flat of the Yano hard enough to lay a standing horse over sideways, and it drove the snow flat and screaming across a country that had no timber to break it and no fold to hide in, and the mercury went down off the bottom of the little thermometer nailed to the shack wall and kept on going. And out beyond her outside wire the open-range cattle that other men owned began to drift before it, tails to the storm, walking south because there was nothing else left in them to do, walking until a fence or a bluff or their own dying stopped them. Inside her wire it was another thing altogether, and the difference was 3.5 years of her own arithmetic made solid. She had not bunched her cattle into one helpless bawling mass the way fear would have done it. She had cut the herd into manageable bunches and set each bunch down into a draw she had chosen a year before for its shelter and its water. A crease of ground where the rimrock threw the wind up and over so the snow could not pack in the bottom, and down the length of every one of those draws ran a hay line she had bought cheap and stacked high the summer the barons were dumping their hay to raise cash against the drought. That was the whole of it. And It was everything. Where Verlot and Harmon Sloat and Dunstan Pryor had turned their cattle loose on a burnt range and trusted to grass that was not there and to a God who does not garnish a man's foolishness, Ada Mercer had trusted to hay in the stack and water she could reach, and a wall of wire between her stock and the wind, and now, on the first night of it, her machine turned over and held. The water was the thing that killed as surely as the cold. For a beast will live a long while on short feed, but a beast that cannot drink dies in the snow with its belly full, and every spring and seep she had bought and fenced along the escarpment wanted tending now, because the cold worked all night to lid them over with ice. So she set the crews to the water in shifts, 2 men and then 2 men, riding the line of the open springs with axes across their saddlebows and chopping the ice back off the pool edges every few hours through the dark so the cattle could get their muzzles down to it. And the axes rang thin and flat in the wind, and the chopped ice froze again behind them almost as fast as they cut it. And they cut it anyway, and again, because that was the work, and the work did not care that it was cold. Delfino ran the cattle end of it, the way he had run cattle for 40 years before he ever heard the Mercer name, a small, bowed old vaquero who could read a bunch of Longhorns in the dark by the sound they made. And he knew before a bunch broke that it was going to break, and got a rider drifting into it, soft and low, and singing to hold it before the panic took. Because a herd that drifts through its own fence in a blizzard is a herd you bury, and Delfino did not intend to bury Mercer cattle over a thing that a little patience could hold. Colton Vane led the gathers. 4 years back he had been the town joke's husband, a proud debt-ridden man married off on a fence rail wager to the big dressmaker everyone laughed at, and somewhere in the 3.5 years since he had stopped being that man, without either of them making a speech about it, and now when a bunch scattered off a bedground in the night it was Colton who took the worst side of the storm with 2 hands behind him and brought them back, riding blind with the ice-caked white and his mustache and his horse walking on faith, and he did not do it because anyone made him, and he did not do it for love, or not for love only. He did it because it was his to do, and he had come to want the doing of it, and Ada watched him ride out into the white the first night and the 10th, and did not say the thing she felt, which was that she would have kept him for this alone. Storm followed storm. That was the shape of the whole winter, the die-up winter of '86 and '87 that men on the plains would still be measuring their lives against when they were old, a blizzard, and then a false thaw that crusted the snow to a shell a cow could not paw through. And then a harder blizzard laid down on top of the crust, and then a cold so deep and so still and so long that the smoke stood straight up off the shack chimney, and the trees down in the breaks split open with a sound like a rifle. And through all of it the Mercer machine held, not because the winter was kind to it, for the winter was kind to nothing, but because every part of it had been built in the warm months by a woman who lay awake doing sums against exactly this. The hay held because she had bought 4 times what a sane man said she needed. The water held because the crews would not let it freeze. The cattle held because they were sheltered and fed and watered, and because Delfino and Colton and the small, steady crew rode them in shifts around the clock and lost sleep instead of stock, and the tally book on the shack table filled up night by night in Ada's hand with a count of what lived, which was nearly all of it, while 11 miles north the open range was becoming a graveyard. It was in the deep middle of that winter that the thing happened which the plateau would remember longest, longer even than the count, and it happened because of where her north gap lay. There was a low saddle in the rimrock at the top of her north line where the wind funneled, and against the wire strung across that saddle one gray morning after a 3-day blow, a drift of dying cattle had piled, not her cattle, but the little bunch belonging to Orrin Beckett, a small, stubborn man who ran a few hundred head on open range off her north corner and had laughed with the rest of them once and had nothing now but cattle walking to their death against another outfit's fence. They had drifted before the storm the way open cattle do and fetched up against her wire because her wire was the first thing in 40 miles that stopped them, and they were standing there humped and blind and freezing, going down one at a time into the snow. And a man with a hard heart and a legal mind would have let the wire hold and let them die on the wrong side of it, because they were not his, and the grass and the hay behind the wire were dear and bought and counted. Ada Mercer rode up to that gap with Delfino, and she looked at the dying cattle a long moment, and then she got down and cut her own wire. She opened the fence she had strung at such cost and turned Beckett's freezing cattle through it into a spare draw she had been holding in reserve, a sheltered fold with a seep in the bottom of it, and she had the crew fork down to them what hay she could spare from the edge of her own margin, not all they wanted, for she could not feed the whole dying country and would not pretend to, but enough to hold the life in the ones that still had life to hold. And then she did the thing that made it Mercer, and not mere mercy. She tallied them. She sat her horse in the cold and counted every head that went through the gap and wrote the number in the book, and beside it the day, and every morning after she counted what had lived of them and marked the feet against them, honest to the forkful, because charity that keeps no books breeds a grudge on both sides, and she meant no grudge, she meant a square account. When the spring came and Orrin Beckett walked up her draw hat in hand to see what the storm had left him, she handed him his living cattle and the tally in the same motion, and she named him a price that was cost and feed and not 1 cent of profit over it, and Beckett paid it, and shook her hand instead of touching his hat to her, which between two people who run cattle means more. And he told it in Caprock afterward the way a man tells a thing he cannot get over, that the Mercer brand had cut its own wire for another man's stock, and then kept books so fair a preacher couldn't have bettered them, and after that the word on the plateau for what the Mercer brand meant was not only that it was rich, which it plainly was, but that it was square, which is the rarer thing. And the two together are how you build something that outlasts you. Out beyond her wire the open range died, and the dying of it she saw mostly in its aftermath, which was mercy enough, for the doing of it did not bear looking at. When the long cold finally broke, and the snow drew back off the flat in dirty rotting sheets, it uncovered what the winter had been about all along. The drift fences where the open cattle had walked before the storm until the wire stopped them and then stood and died in windrows, bone-gray lines of carcasses laid along the fences for a mile at a stretch, hide and horn and nothing left inside, and the buzzards standing on the posts too, gorged to fly. The creeks came up brown and foul with it in the thaw, and down the wagon roads to the railhead came the only harvest that country would take that year, the wagons stacked and swaying with stiff frozen hides peeled off the dead, the hide men working the range like a battlefield after the guns go quiet, because the beef was lost and gone, and a hide was the last dollar a dead steer could be made to give, and the whole plateau smelled of it for a month. Men said afterward that the open range never came back, that the winter of the big die-up killed the old free way of running cattle as dead as it killed the cattle, and that from that spring on the country belonged to whoever had fenced his grass and stacked his hay and dug in, which is to say the country belonged, now, to Ada Mercer, though it took the men who had laughed at the fence rail a while yet to say the words. She said her own number first, out loud, on branding day. They gathered and worked the whole of it in the green flush of that spring, the crews riding the draws and combing the cattle down out of the sheltered folds to the branding ground below the shack. And the fires were lit, and the irons heated, and the calves of that first big drop went down and came up wearing the Mercer brand, and Delfino called the tally to a boy who marked it, and the boy called it to Ada, who wrote it in the book, and at the end of the last day of it, with the crew leaning on the fence, rails filthy and worn down, and quietly proud, Ada Mercer stood up on the low rail where they could all hear her and read them the count. 4,060 head, she said, owned outright by the Mercer brand or running on its grass on shares. 4,060 up from 37 starving Longhorns bought for hide and tallow money 3.5 years back off men who laughed while they took her money. She did not raise her voice to say it, and she did not need to. She let the number stand in the spring air by itself, and the crew heard it, the whole ladder of it laid end to end, 37 and then 400 and now 4,060. And one of the young hands took his hat off without seeming to know he'd done it, and Colton Vane, leaning on the top rail with a branding scorch on his glove, looked at his wife reading numbers off a book and did not smile so much as ease, the way a man eases who has finally set down a thing he'd carried a long way. And the winter that had built her that number had broken everyone who had bet against it. The beef market, which a fool would have thought must rise when so many cattle had died, did the opposite and bottomed out, because every ruined outfit on the plains threw its gaunt survivors onto the market at once to raise $1 against its paper, and a flood of poor, thin, distressed cattle drove the price of beef down through the floor in the very season the barons needed it high. Verl Ott, who had bet 2 weeks and turned his cattle loose to the storm, was broke outright, his range a boneyard, and his account at the bank a single red line. Harmon Sloat, who had bet 3 months and had come to her fence the summer before with his hat in his hand to lease the only grass left alive, had his notes called, and no cattle worth the calling. And Dunstan Pryor, proudest of the three, who had held his overstocked herd on the open range through the whole drought on nothing but pride, and then mortgaged the /P itself to carry it, watched his mortgage go under water as the dead cattle that secured it turned to hides and his grass turned to dust, until the paper on his home place was worth more than the place and the herd behind it put together. And on a Monday in that spring, Ambrose Teal, who held all 3 men's paper in the vault of the Stockman's Bank of Caprock, tacked a printed notice to his own front door: public auction, by order and necessity, of notes and mortgages and lands and brands, the ruined paper of the plateau to go under the hammer to whoever came with money. 3 men had sat a fence rail once and priced a marriage at 2 weeks, and now their names were on a notice nailed to a bank door, and the woman they had laughed at could read every one of them from the street. And into the middle of that spring, up over the eastern rim on the very ground the die-up had emptied, came the survey stakes. They walked out of the breaks in a straight line 1 section at a time, little cloth flags on laths snapping in the wind, the transit men behind them squinting through their glass, laying out the grade of the Fort Worth and Denver City Railroad coming north up the plateau, at last. And behind the survey came a soft-spoken man in a town coat named Quincy Farnsworth, an agent of the road, asking the questions a railroad asks when it means to build. He wanted cattle in volume to fill its stock cars and make the line pay. He wanted water in quantity for its engines, for a steam locomotive drinks like a herd and must drink where it stands. And he wanted level ground near the grade to lay out shipping pens. He asked his questions all up and down the plateau. And every road he followed, and every answer he got, led him to the same gate, because when he ran his finger up, the only workable line the grade could take across that broken country it crossed and recrossed the deeded sections Ada Mercer had bought for $2 an acre around every live spring on the rim. And when he looked for the flat, well-watered ground worth grading into stock pens, he found she owned that too, every foot of it worth the having, bought quiet in the drought while other men called her a fool for buying alkali. Farnsworth came to the shack with his hat in his hand, which by now was how men came, and he sat at her table and named what the road wanted. And Ada Mercer opened the tally book to a clean page and wrote out her terms in her own hand while he watched. Her price per loaded car off her own scales, her scales and no others to weigh the beef the price was paid on, her pens on her ground built and held by her, and the right-of-way across her sections priced by the section and not given away. And she wrote it plain and slow, the way her father had taught her to write anything that money would ever hang on. And when she was done, she made him a fair copy of the page and kept the book. And Quincy Farnsworth read it twice and folded the fair copy into his breast pocket and said the road would want to study it, but that he did not think, looking at the map, that the road had another way to come, and he rode back down the line carrying a page with a cattlewoman's price written on it in a hand as even as a printed rule. The night before the auction she sat late at the shack table under the lamp figuring the last of it. The price of beef she meant to name out loud in the bank the next morning, laying the numbers down per hundredweight against her scales and the rail contract and the dead market until the figure was a wall no man in that room would be able to argue with, because arithmetic is not a thing you argue with. And Colton Vane sat across the lamp from her and watched her write, and after a while he said, "Quiet," not making a speech of it, because he had learned long ago she had no use for speeches. For years back, they bet I couldn't keep you. He turned his coffee cup a half-turn on the boards. Nobody thought to bet whether you'd keep me, and Ada Mercer did not look up from the book, and something moved at the corner of her mouth that in another woman might have gone all the way to a smile, and she dipped the pen again and kept writing. Because the figure was not finished, and morning was coming. It came gray and clean over the rim. She was up before the light, and she dressed for it in a plain gray dress she had cut and sewn herself over the long shut in weeks of the winter, sitting up nights with her needle by the same lamp she kept her books by, the dressmaker's hands that the whole town had joked about turning out one more good, plain, honest thing that fit her exactly and asked no one's leave, no lace on it, and no show. Only straight seams and a fit true to the woman inside it, which was the only kind of garment she had ever made and the only kind she had ever needed. She took up her father's tally book, Book 1, the one Ezra Mercer had started before she was born and she had kept since she was 12. And she took up the current book beside it, the one that ended in 4,060 and the price of beef, and she went out into the cold spring morning with a book under each arm. And she walked down the middle of Caprock's main street toward the Stockman's Bank, with Colton Vane a half-step behind her and old Delfino a half-step behind him. The two of them following the gray figure with the books the way men follow a thing they have decided to follow, and the town came out onto its board sidewalks to watch the big dressmaker they had married off on a bet walk to the bank. On auction morning, and she did not hurry and she did not slow, and the books under her arms were heavier than any gun. The Stockman's Bank of Caprock stood at the head of the main street where it had always stood. A squat building of milled board and river stone with a door of good oak that Ambrose Teal had ordered up from Fort Worth in a fatter year. And Ada Mercer put her hand flat against that oak and pushed it open the way she pushed open everything, without hurry and without noise, and stepped into the cold front room in the plain gray dress she had cut and sewn herself over the long winter, with her father's tally book under one arm and the current book under the other. And behind her by a half-step came Colton with his hat already in his hand, and Delfino with his own held against his chest. And the room full of men who had gathered to watch the plateau sold off its bones went quiet the way a yard of cattle goes quiet when the one still thing walks in among them. There were 30-odd of them crowded on the benches and along the back wall, and most of them had laughed on the fence rail 4 years gone, and every one of them turned to look at the big dressmaker they had married off to settle a bet, and not one of them laughed now, because a man does not laugh in a room where he is about to lose his land, and because the woman in the doorway was carrying 2 ledgers into a fight the rest of them had come to with nothing in there. Hands but their hats. Ambrose Teal stood at the front behind a long counter with a gavel by his right hand and the ruined paper stacked square by his left, the whole feeling weight of the plateau, reduced to inked notes and mortgages and posted deeds, and he cleared his throat and welcomed the room in the careful voice of a man who has learned that a bank auction is a funeral where the corpse is money. And he took up the first bundle and read it out. Verlot's notes came first, because Ott was broke the cleanest and the paper was the plainest. 4 notes against a man who had run good cattle on the North Flat and run them into a killing winter and out the other side owing more than the whole outfit would fetch at the top of a good year, and there was no top of a good year to be had. And Teal called for a bid, and the room said nothing. Ada let the nothing sit a moment, the way her father had taught her to let a thing sit until its own shape showed, and then she said, in the flat working voice the plateau had spent 4 years learning to stop underestimating, a figure that was cents on the dollar of the face, and Teal looked at her, and looked at the room, and asked was there any advance on that, and the room, which had no cash money in it worth the name, and knew whose grass had wintered and whose had not, held its peace, and a gavel came down. She paid it out of the Mercer account in Fort Worth against a draft Teal himself had to honor, and she took Verlot's paper into her hand. And then She did the thing she had come 4 years and 41 weeks to do, which was not to make a speech, because she had never once in her life made a speech and did not intend to start in a bank. She opened her father's book to a page she had marked with a length of gray thread cut from the same bolt as her dress. And she turned it so the men on the near bench could see the entry standing there in her own hand in ink gone brown with age, a date and a line, and she said quietly to Verl Ott, where he sat with his hands hanging between his knees, "You gave it 2 weeks, Mr. Ott. It has held 3 years and 41 weeks. The book has the exact day." And that was all. She did not say what she now held, or what it had cost him, or what she thought of a man who had priced her marriage at a fortnight on a fence rail. She said the number. And the number was the whole of it. And Verl Ott looked at the line in the old book, and his jaw worked, and he found he had nothing to put against arithmetic, which is the one argument a broke man cannot borrow his way out of, and he looked away. Teal took up the second bundle. Harmon Slote's paper was a heavier thing, a mortgage on a house in town and notes on a middling herd, and Slote was not broke the way Ott was broke. Slote had a good house with a glass window and a wife who kept it, and Slote sat straighter and had come meaning to hold on to something. And when Teal called the mortgage, Slote's own man tried a bid, a thin, hopeful figure thrown up by a cousin with a little cash, and Ada let him have his moment and then laid her figure over the top of it, calm as laying a card, and the cousin looked at Slote, and Slote looked at the floor, and the second bid did not come, and a gavel came down again. But she did not buy the house. She had marked, in the current book, which of the ruined paper was land and water and grass, and which was only a roof over a family, and when she had the mortgage in her hand she looked at Harmon Slote, and she said, "You may keep your house, Mr. Slote." And she meant it, and she said it so the room heard it, and then she turned the current book to its marked page and set her finger on the entry and said, 3 months, you said. The grass is mine now. 2 sentences, no more. The mercy and the reckoning laid side by side on the same breath the way they had always sat side by side in her, because the woman who had let a neighbor's dying drift through her north gap and fed them and tallied every head and settled fair at spring for cost and feed was the same woman who now held the note on the grass a man had bet she could not keep her marriage. Long enough to grow, and there was no contradiction in it that any honest ledger could find. Harmon Slote kept his house and lost his grass, and understood, sitting there, that he had been beaten by a woman who had troubled to know the difference, and that was a harder thing to carry than plain ruin. Then Teal took up the last and heaviest bundle, and the room drew its breath, because the last bundle was Dunstan Pryor's, the /P mortgage, 4 sections of deeded ground, and the brand and the paper on 1,100 head, the biggest single piece of the plateau to come across that counter, and Dunstan Pryor had not come to sit with his hat in his hands. He stood along the side wall in a good coat, with a narrow Eastern man beside him whom nobody in Caprock knew. And when Teal called the /P, the Eastern man bid, and he bid high, near the face of the paper, a number that rang in that cash-poor room like a church bell in a dry creek. And Teal looked frankly startled, and asked the man to state his principle, and the Eastern man said he bid for a commission house in Kansas City, authorized to take the /P at value. And there was a stir along the benches, because that was a bluff dressed as a rescue, a proxy thrown up to run the price past what a plateau widow could pay, and hand Pryor's ground to a house that would lease it back to him and let him keep his seat, and for one moment the whole 4 years hung on whether the woman in gray had the cash or the nerve to chase a number like that. Etta did not chase it. She set her father's book down on Teal's counter, and beside it the current book, and then, one at a time, she began to lay paper on the oak, and the room leaned in to watch her do it, because the paper she laid down was the whole story of the plateau told in ink, and it answered the Eastern man's number without her raising her voice. She laid down first the bill of sale from the autumn of 1883, brown and creased at the folds, 37 head of Longhorn, bought off a foreclosing outfit at $2 the head, hide and tallow money, $74 for the starving scrub the whole town had laughed her into buying, her name and Ezra Mercer's name and the seller's mark at the bottom. She laid beside it the Mercer brand registration from the county book, the running M she had chosen, and recorded that same autumn, stamped and dated and witnessed. She laid down the recorded deeds then, one after another. The sections she had bought quiet and cheap in the bust years when the barons were selling to cover their notes, every deed with water on it or water under it. The spring sections that rang the whole rim of the plateau, and she set them in a row so a man could see with his own eyes that she had come to own every live drop on the high ground, while the men who laughed sold it to her for cash they needed worse than grass. She laid down the hay contracts and the hay receipts the town had laughed at hardest of all. The winter she had bought hay when hay was cheap, because the barons meant to sell cattle and not feed them. Sheaf after sheaf of receipts. The contrarian hay that had carried 4,000 head through the die-up when the open range went to bone. And then, last, she laid down the Fort Worth and Denver City contract, and she said, to Teal, and to the room, and to the narrow eastern man in the good coat, I have income against this bid, and it is set down and signed, and she nodded to the back of the room, where a spare man in a road-dusted suit had been standing quiet by the door the whole while. And Quincy Farnsworth of the railroad stepped forward and took up the contract off the counter and read it out in the plain carrying voice of a man reading a fact. He read that the Fort Worth and Denver City, its spur crested and staked across the deeded Mercer sections and no other workable line to be had, was bound to load its cattle at the Mercer pens, and the Mercer pens only on that stretch of plateau, over the Mercer scales, at the rate set down in the shipper's own hand. And he read the rate. Her price per loaded car written out in Ada Mercer's slanting figures and countersigned by the road, and he laid the page back down on the oak on top of the deeds and the hay and the brand and the 83 bill of sale, receipt laid on receipt, until the counter was covered with the paper record of a thing built one sound piece at a time, and he said, "The road has signed it. The commission house does not have a rail." And the bluff folded. The narrow eastern man leaned and spoke low to Dunstan Pryor, and Pryor's face did the thing a proud face does when it understands it has been outbid, not by a bigger number, but by a truer one. And the eastern man straightened and told Teal, in a dry voice, that his principal withdrew, because a commission house 2,000 miles off does not buy 4 sections of grass it cannot ship cattle off of. And there was no green on that plateau but the Mercer green, and no rail pens but the Mercer pens, and no scales but the Mercer scales. And value is not what a thing costs, but what it can earn. And the earning belonged to the woman in gray. Teal called for any advance, and there was none, and Ada named her figure, a fraction of the face of the paper. And the gavel came down on the /P, and she took Dunstan Pryor's mortgage into her hand the way she had taken the others. And she turned her father's book to the last of the marked pages, and she looked at Dunstan Pryor, who had staked her the dying scrap of ground to seal the bet in the first place, and had priced the marriage at 6 months to the day, and she said, quietly, with no gloat in it, and no triumph a listener could catch hold of, 6 months. Mr. Pryor, the book has the day you said it, and the day it passed. That was the collection of the third IOU, and it was done with the same flat precision as the other two, a number matched to a number, a bet matched to a book, and Dunstan Pryor had built his whole standing on being the man who named prices on the plateau, and he understood, hearing his own 6 months read back to him off a page, that the naming of prices had passed out of his hands and into hers, and he had signed it over himself. 4 years back, on a fence rail, laughing, then Ada Mercer straightened up from the counter, and she gathered the 2 books back under her arms and left the receipts lying where they were for any man in the room to walk up and read, and she said the only thing that morning she said to the whole room at once, and she said it plain, standing in her gray dress with the winter's work behind her, that with the only live water on the high ground, and the only grass that had wintered, and the only hay put by, and the only rail pens and scales on the plateau. The price of beef on this plateau is what the Mercer book says it is, and she named it, a hard figure to the hundredweight at her scales, $4.40 the hundredweight, said out loud so the whole room heard the number, and no man could later claim he had not, and it was a fair price, and a firm one, and it was hers to name, because she owned every link in the chain a steer had to travel from grass to rail car, and she had bought each link honest in the open bust when the men in this room were selling. And then she did the thing that turned a reckoning into an empire, which was to offer the broken men the same terms she had offered every soul on the plateau from the first hard winter forward, no better and no worse, that a man could lease his grass back from the Mercer brand at her written rate and run his own cattle under his own mark and pay her at shipping. Or he could ride for the Mercer brand for fair wages and a bed and beef, and either way he would eat, and either way his family would keep its roof. And there was no charity in it and no cruelty in it, only arithmetic, and the room took the terms. One man, and then his neighbor, and then the whole beaten roomful. Because arithmetic is not an argument, and a man cannot vote down a sum that feeds his. Children and Verl Ott would ride for the brand by spring, and Harmon Sloat would lease back his grass and keep his house and his glass window, and Dunstan Pryor, who had priced her at 6 months, would run /P cattle on Mercer grass at the Mercer rate and pay at the Mercer scales, and that was the whole of the vengeance, if a body wanted to call it that. Though Ada never once called it anything but business, and business was the one language the plateau had never been able to take away from her. 5 autumns on, in the shipping season of 1888, the spur was built, and the pens were hers, and the plateau had a new shape that no man on it would have believed the morning they laughed on the rail. The Fort Worth and Denver City ran a finished line up over the rim to the Mercer loading pens, and down those chutes in that one season the running M shipped 11,000 head, 11,000 fat cattle weighed over Ada Mercer's scales and loaded into Ada Mercer's cars at Ada Mercer's price. And the number was worth saying slow, because the county's own book. The tally the assessor had taken in 1883, the very year they laughed her onto the dying ground, had counted about 8,500 head of cattle in the whole of the county, every brand and every man's herd added together, so that the woman they had married off to settle a bet now shipped more cattle off one plateau in one season than the entire county had owned the day. They priced her marriage at 2 weeks. Delfino was her cow boss, gray now at the temples and easy in the saddle, running crews of riders under the running M across grass that greened every spring along the deeded springs. And the men who had bet against her leased their grass from her or drew her wages, and the tally books, her father's and her own, and the row of them she had filled since, sat in a locked case in the ranch house office, where a girl who had kept her father's figures since she was 12 now kept the figures of the largest cattle outfit between the Canadian and a Caprock. And Colton Vane stood at the loading chute the morning the first cattle train of that season took its cars. The debt-ridden man they had staked a scrap of dying ground to marry her, long since humbled clean through into respect and past respect, into a love he had never once made a speech about, because he had learned her way of saying things with work instead of words. And as the engine took the slack and the couplings rang down the line and 11,000 head began the long roll to the Fort Worth market at the price her book had named, he took off his hat and held it against his chest and stood a half-step back in her shadow, watching her watch her cattle go, and that was the whole of the romance and the whole of the empire in one picture. A man with his hat to his heart in the shadow of the woman the town had called its joke, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying that the loaded cars were not already saying for them. And down below the pens, at the bottom of the main street, the old stockyard fence rail still ran along the sorting yard where it had run in 1883, the same weathered rail where 3 cattle barons had once sat in the sun and priced a marriage at 6 months and 3 months and 2 weeks and staked a dying scrap of ground to seal it. And the rail was still there, and the yard was still there, but the pens beyond it were Mercer pens now, and the scales were Mercer scales, and the price called out over them in shipping season was the price the Mercer book named. And the 3 men who had sat that rail and laughed either leased their grass from the woman they had laughed at, or rode for her wages, or had gone away quiet. And the rail and the pens and the scales and the price all belonged, every board and every pound and every dollar of them, to her. The running M outlived every man who had ever bet against it, and it shipped its cattle off that plateau for the long good years of a woman who had come to Caprock a dressmaker the whole town joked about, and kept her father's tally books since she was 12, and turned 37 starving Longhorns into a Texas Empire One Sound some at a time. And Ada Mercer lived out a long and well-worked life on the high ground she had bought when it was cheap and made green when it counted, and the last number the plateau ever learned to say about her was the true one. 11,000 head over her own scales in a single season, more than the county had owned the day they laughed. And it was said calm, the way she had said everything. And then the season turned, and the grass came back along the springs the way it always came back for hands that did not quit, and the cattle grazed the rim, and the plateau was hers, and it was quiet, and it was enough.